Hey everyone out there in K-12 land. Things are always interesting in education, shall we say. And today we're diving into something that could really shake things up for you in the classroom.
Yeah, that's right. We're taking a look at the idea of completely eliminating the U.S. Department of Education.
Whoa, that's a big one. So this isn't just some theoretical debate, right?
Nope. There's actually a reported executive order from early 2025 that aims to, well, start winding things down.
Okay, so the goal is to basically shift all those education decisions from the federal level right back down to states and local communities.
Exactly.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, this impacts teachers, students, everything. So we've got a ton of information to sort through.
Two.
We'll dig into the arguments for actually getting rid of the department, look at the potential downsides, because there are definitely some concerns out there,
For sure.
and even consider some alternatives. We want to help you understand what these shifts could really mean for you on the ground.
Sounds good.
So let's start with the why. Why are some people so gung-ho about getting rid of the Department of Education?
Well, the core of it is all about, local control. More flexibility, less of that top-down federal stuff.
Yeah, the idea is to give more power to the people who are closest to the students, state and local officials, school boards, parents.
Right. Let them make the decisions about education policy instead of having it all come from Washington.
There's a strong feeling from some folks that decisions should be made by parents, states, and communities. That's a direct quote. And that really aligns with the idea that the best education is closest to the child.
It does. And I think that's at the heart of this push. They want school policies that really reflect the specific values and needs of each community.
Like even down to the nitty-gritty, right? School calendars,
Yeah.
specific programs, different approaches to teaching.
Exactly. Letting each community decide what's best for them. And that ties into the whole argument about curriculum flexibility and innovation.
Ah, yeah, now that's something I bet a lot of teachers have opinions about. So the thinking is, if you get rid of all those federal mandates, all those standardized requirements,
States and individual districts would have way more freedom to decide what gets taught and how it's taught.
and that could mean more creative teaching, right? You wouldn't be so tied to a rigid set of national standards.
Right. Think about states setting their own academic standards, choosing how they want to assess students, experimenting with totally new teaching models without needing approval from the feds.
It's this idea that innovation thrives when you give that kind of freedom to local educators. And it's not just about math and science, is it? This also applies to how schools handle those more sensitive topics.
You got it. Things that could be controversial, letting communities decide how they want those things addressed in their schools. Now, of course, this whole local control thing is a big part of it. But there's also this whole other argument about bureaucracy.
Yeah, the red tape argument.
People say the Department of Education has just become this massive bureaucratic machine with tons of regulations and paperwork, and they question whether all of that is really making a difference for students.
Okay, so the argument is if you get rid of that federal oversight, maybe teachers and principals can actually spend less time on all that administrative stuff
Less time filling out forms, writing reports, all that compliance stuff.
and more time actually, teaching and running their schools.
Right. Doing what they do best.
And there's that statistic that gets thrown around, about how we spend billions on education at the federal level, but we haven't seen these huge gains in test scores nationwide.
Yeah, some people point to that and say, see, all this federal bureaucracy isn't actually making things better.
So the belief is, by shrinking that federal bureaucracy, you could actually return power to the states and parents, to use their phrase.
And more importantly, get that funding flowing directly to classrooms. Less administrative overhead. More money for things that actually matter in the classroom.
Okay, now, you can't talk about this whole thing without mentioning school choice, right? Charter schools, vouchers, this is all tied together.
It is. The argument is, if you don't have this big federal department in charge, it's easier to implement policies that let funding follow the student wherever they go to school.
Okay, so if a family wants to send their child to a charter school, the funding goes with them.
Exactly. And the argument is, this gives parents more control, more options, which ultimately ensures our nation's youth are put first.
And they argue that the Department of Education has actually been a roadblock to expanding school choice.
They do. We've even heard some lawmakers praising this idea, talking about giving education back to parents and making school choice a reality for everyone.
So for teachers, this could mean more students attending charter schools or using vouchers to go to private schools.
It could.
You might end up working in a school that parents specifically chose for their kids, which, could lead to more involved families, more support from parents.
It's definitely possible. The hope is that more competition between schools would lead to better quality overall. Parents would be driving that change.
Okay, so we've talked about local control, less bureaucracy, school choice.
Right.
But underpinning all of this, the big idea is that education should primarily be a state and local responsibility.
Right. The federal government has its role, but states actually provide the vast majority of the funding for K-12 education, like 90%.
Okay, so shifting more decision-making power to the states would kind of align things with the way the funding already works.
Exactly. Now, those are the main arguments for getting rid of the department. But there's another side to this story, right? There are some serious concerns about what could happen if this actually went through.
Yeah, and as we go through these, I think it's important for all of us, especially teachers, to think about how this could affect equity in schools and support for those students who need it the most.
Definitely. One of the biggest worries is about funding for low-income schools.
Right, because the Department of Education does a lot to direct money to those high-poverty districts, like with Title I.
Exactly. Title I is huge. Almost two-thirds of public schools in the country get Title I funding. And that money pays for extra teachers, tutoring, books, all kinds of resources.
And it's all about helping students from low-income families succeed. So the worry is that if you take away that federal oversight, that money might not get to the students who need it the most.
It's a really big concern, right? Because this isn't just about some abstract idea of local control. It's about real resources that make a huge difference in the lives of kids.
It is, and some people are worried about this shift towards no strings attached block grants.
So basically just giving states a chunk of money and saying, do what you want with it.
Yeah, pretty much. And the fear is that states might use that money to replace their own education spending instead of actually adding to it.
So instead of getting extra resources, those schools might end up with less.
It's a possibility. Wow, for teachers in those schools, that could be devastating. We're talking larger class sizes, fewer support staff, cuts to programs.
It could definitely happen. And it could make the gap between wealthy and poor districts even wider. Because right now, federal aid helps to even things out a little bit.
Okay, so funding is one big worry. But what about students with disabilities? That's another area where the federal government plays a huge role.
Right. We're talking about IDA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Yeah, IDEA guarantees every student with a disability a free, appropriate public education, and that costs money. The Department of Education helps to fund special education teachers, therapies, materials, all of that.
And more importantly, they oversee how IDA is being implemented. They make sure states are actually following the law and providing those services.
So if you get rid of the department, who takes over that responsibility?
That's the big question. There isn't another federal agency that has the same level of experience and expertise in special education.
So you could end up with 50 different states doing things 50 different ways.
Exactly. And that could lead to some real inconsistency. Some students might get the support they need, while others fall through the cracks.
The National Education Association, they're really worried about this. They've talked about the potential for fewer special education services, even the possibility of students losing accommodations that they're legally entitled to under IDA.
It's a serious concern.
And for teachers, this could mean less training in special education, fewer resources to meet the needs of your students. It could mean that some kids aren't getting the evaluations or support they need when they need it.
It's definitely something to think about. And then we have to talk about civil rights protections. That's another area where the Department of Education plays a huge role.
Right. Specifically, their Office for Civil Rights, the OCR. They're the ones who enforce those federal civil rights laws in schools.
They investigate claims of discrimination, make sure schools are treating all students fairly, address things like bullying and harassment.
And if you eliminate the department, that enforcement power could be significantly weakened.
It's almost certain. There's been talk of moving some of those functions to the Department of Justice, but that raises its own set of concerns.
Right, because then it becomes a legal battle. Individual families would have to go through the courts to get justice. That's a lot harder than filing a complaint with the OCR.
A lot harder. And a lot less likely to happen.
And without that proactive oversight from the federal government, there's a real risk that schools could get away with practices that are discriminatory.
They could. Think about disparities in discipline, unequal access to programs, even things like facilities for transgender students. If there's no one watching, those problems could get worse.
The ACLU has been very vocal about this. They've said that getting rid of the department would strip students of vital resources and tear down functions essential to addressing racial and economic inequality.
That's a strong statement, but I think it reflects a very real concern.
And for teachers, this could mean less guidance on how to create those inclusive and equitable classrooms, less support when you're dealing with challenging situations.
It could. And for students who are already facing discrimination, it could mean fewer avenues to get help, fewer ways to fight back.
Students of color, English language learners, LGBTQ plus youth, they could be particularly vulnerable if those federal protections go away.
It's a real worry.
Okay, so we've talked about funding, special education, civil rights, all incredibly important issues. But there's another potential downside that often gets overlooked:
What's that?
teacher development and student support programs. These aren't just about regulations, they're about providing resources and support to educators and students.
Right. We're talking professional development grants,
Yeah.
scholarships and loan forgiveness programs for teachers, funding for school counselors, librarians, nurses.
Yeah, programs like Title II and Title IV. And if the department goes away, all of those programs could be on the chopping block.
They could.
And for teachers, that could mean fewer opportunities to grow professionally, fewer chances to learn new skills and stay up to date on the latest research.
It could.
And for students, it could mean losing access to valuable support services, after-school programs, tutoring, mental health support. Those things make a huge difference.
Do.
And if you cut those programs, it's not just the students who suffer. It makes your job as a teacher so much harder. You have fewer resources to help those kids who are struggling.
Definitely. And we know from tons of research that investing in education, both in teachers and in student support services, leads to better student outcomes. So cutting those investments, dismantling the structures that support them, it just doesn't make sense.
So if you add all of this up, the potential loss of funding, the weakening of special education and civil rights protections, the cuts to teacher development and support programs, it paints a pretty concerning picture, doesn't it?
It does. The big worry is that we could lose this national framework that tries to ensure a basic level of fairness and support for all students.
Right. Because even though federal funding only makes up a small percentage of the overall education budget.
That federal oversight, those targeted programs, they act as a safety net. They help to prevent the worst kinds of inequities that can happen when everything is left up to individual states.
Yeah. And there's a real fear that we could see a rollback of decades of progress in areas like special education and civil rights.
Right. All those gains that have been made, often with bipartisan support, could be lost.
So given all of these risks, a lot of people are saying, okay, maybe eliminating the department completely is too extreme.
Right. Maybe there's a middle ground, a way to reform the department without getting rid of it entirely.
So it's not just about yes or no, it's about finding a more balanced approach, one that acknowledges the value of local control, but also preserves those essential federal safeguards.
Exactly. It's about rethinking the role of the federal government in education, not just erasing it.
Okay, so what would this balanced approach actually look like?
Well, one key element is protecting federal funding for equity.
Okay, so that means continuing to provide dedicated funding for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, but maybe giving states more flexibility in how they use that money.
Right. Like with Title I, for example. You could still have that funding stream for high-poverty schools, but give states more say in how they use it to support their students.
So as long as they can show that the money is actually being used effectively, they get more leeway.
Exactly. The federal government would still set those big picture goals, like improving low-performing schools and closing achievement gaps. And they would require states to be transparent about their results. But the specifics of how they get there, that would be up to the states and local districts.
Okay, so it's about finding that balance between federal oversight and local control.
Right. And making sure that the funding is still targeted to the students who need it most. Because we know that investing in those students makes a huge difference.
Now, another absolutely crucial part of this balanced approach is maintaining a strong federal role in protecting civil rights and student rights.
Absolutely. This has to be non-negotiable.
So instead of eliminating the Office for Civil Rights, maybe you keep it within a smaller Department of Education, or even create a separate independent agency that just focuses on civil rights in schools.
Either way, it needs to be well-staffed and have a clear process for handling complaints.
Because even with more local control, you still need that federal watchdog to make sure that schools are treating all students fairly.
You do. They need to be monitoring for discrimination, ensuring equal access to programs, addressing bullying and harassment, all of that.
And if a school is found to be violating those civil rights, the federal government has to be able to step in and take action.
Right. That's essential. It sends a clear message that those protections matter, and it provides a safety net for students and families.
Okay, so funding and civil rights, those are two big pieces of this alternative. What about special education?
That's another area where continued federal involvement is seen as absolutely vital. The idea is to maintain that federal oversight of IDEA, keep that funding stream going to support those essential services.
Right, because special education is often very expensive. States and districts need that federal help to provide those services.
They do. And the federal government needs to make sure that states are actually meeting their obligations under IDEA.
Okay, so the core guarantee of a free, appropriate public education for students with disabilities, that wouldn't change.
Right. States might get some more flexibility in how they manage things, but the basic rights of those students would still be protected by the federal government.
And this same principle would apply to other vulnerable student groups as well, like English language learners. They rely on federal funding for language support services.
Exactly. And low-income and minority students who benefit from programs that promote access to advanced coursework and enrichment opportunities.
So it's about ensuring that all students, regardless of their background or their individual needs, have a chance to succeed.
Right. And that teachers have the resources they need to support those students.
Now, when it comes to curriculum and testing, this balanced approach suggests a significant shift towards more state and local control.
That's right. The idea is to let go of those prescriptive federal mandates and let states have more say in what and how they teach.
So states would get to set their own academic standards, choose their own textbooks, design their own assessments.
Exactly. They could decide whether to adopt something like Common Core or go in a completely different direction.
And the federal government's role would shift from dictating to supporting.
Right. They could provide research, offer guidance, share best practices, but they wouldn't be telling states what to do.
And this could apply to testing as well, right?
It could. States might still be required to test students in reading and math, to measure progress and identify achievement gaps, but they might have more flexibility in how often they test, what kinds of tests they use, even whether to incorporate other measures of student learning.
And this isn't a totally new idea, is it?
Not at all. The Every Student Succeeds Act that was passed back in 2015 that already moved us in this direction,
Yep.
giving states more responsibility for school accountability.
So this balanced approach would build on that, set those broad goals at the national level, but empower states to figure out the details.
Exactly. And the hope is that this would lead to more innovation at the local level.
Right. Teachers would have more freedom to tailor their instruction to their students' needs and to the unique context of their community.
It could be a real game changer.
Okay, so we've talked about funding, civil rights, special education, curriculum, testing, all big, complex areas. But what about the federal education agency itself? What happens to that in this alternative model?
Well, the idea is to streamline it, make it smaller and more efficient, less focused on issuing mandates and regulations.
Okay, so less bureaucracy.
Right. More focused on supporting states and providing resources.
So maybe you consolidate some of those smaller federal programs into block grants, give states more flexibility in how they use that money.
That's one idea. But you still need accountability. States would have to show that they're using the money to help students who need it most and to achieve those broader goals that we talked about.
So less paperwork, less red tape, but still making sure that the money is being used responsibly.
Exactly. And the federal agency could also take on this role of being a clearinghouse for best practices.
Oh, that's interesting. So instead of telling states what to do, they'd be sharing research, highlighting what's working in different parts of the country.
Exactly. And offering technical assistance to states that need help.
Okay, so more of a collaborative approach, partnering with states instead of dictating to them.
Right. But they would still have that watchdog function. If a state is failing to serve certain groups of students or misusing funds, the federal government would need to step in.
So it's about striking that balance again, enabling local solutions, but still having those safeguards in place. Now, if we think about all of this from the perspective of teachers and students, what does this alternative approach really mean? How would it impact your daily work and the lives of your students?
Well, the big thing is, it tries to preserve those essential supports that many schools and students rely on.
So, for example, schools in high poverty areas would likely continue to receive that federal funding, They could keep class sizes manageable, provide those extra resources.
Right, and teachers would still have access to professional development opportunities, to research on effective teaching strategies, all of that.
Okay, so those supports wouldn't disappear, but at the same time, teachers might have more say in the curriculum they teach, the way they assess students.
Right, because those decisions would be made closer to home at the state and local level.
And that can mean more freedom to try new things, to really tailor your instruction to the specific needs of your students and your community.
Exactly. And students would benefit from both sides of this. They'd still have those guaranteed rights and resources provided by the federal government. But they'd also get an educational experience that's more tailored to their state's context, driven by local innovation.
And for families, those federal protections for students with disabilities and students facing discrimination, those would remain in place.
They would. But families might also have more opportunities to get involved at the local level, to have a voice in those decisions about what their children are learning.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, isn't it? Getting the benefits of decentralization without sacrificing those essential national commitments to equity and opportunity.
Exactly. It's about states and the federal government working together as partners.
To create a system that truly serves all students.
That's the goal. Now, of course, this balanced approach, it's not perfect. It would be really challenging to implement. It would require a lot of careful thought and planning, a lot of cooperation between different levels of government.
I think it's an important conversation to have because the stakes are so high.
They are. We're talking about the future of education in this country and the impact it has on millions of students and teachers.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it really comes down to that central tension we've been exploring.
Right. Local control versus federal oversight. The desire for flexibility and innovation balanced against the need to protect students and ensure equity.
And we've tried to give you, our amazing K-12 teachers out there, a better understanding of the arguments on both sides of this issue, the potential risks and benefits.
We hope this helps you navigate this complex landscape and advocate for what you believe is best for your students in your schools.
And it really comes down to this. As you think about these potential changes, what aspects of your work and your students' well-being do you feel most strongly need to be protected?
What are those non-negotiables?
And on the other hand, what are the areas where you think more local control, more freedom to innovate could actually make things better for your students?
Those are questions worth thinking about and talking about because the decisions we make today will have a profound impact on the future of education in America.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We appreciate you taking the time to explore this important issue with us.
And keep those conversations going. Keep advocating for what you believe in, because your voices matter, your work matters, and the future of our students depends on it.